One of the side effects of this identity movement, which is that, we're all just glorious and perfect the way we are, and everything about us needs to be affirmed because it's marvelous and beautiful and right and good because it's my identity. There is, I think, a subspecies of that, a movement that is starting to try and affirm and celebrate singleness in and of itself. And you'll see this in Christian circles. Now, I am mature enough, I'm secure enough to admit as a 33-year-old single man that singleness is not good in and of itself. So we need to get rid of that notion straight away. God has actually said it unbelievably clearly. And it is God's intention that the overwhelming majority of people get married. It's what we were designed for. You realize that the man wasn't complete without the woman, and the woman was made for the man, right? They're actually for each other. That's why there are man and woman in the world. It's really amazing how that in this day and age, well, for a long time in different ways actually, and in different cultures for different reasons, men and women are driven apart. And there's all sorts of, at the moment there's the whole oppression thing, patriarchy and all that kind of stuff. That undermines the relationship between the sexes. There is the denigration of things like marriages and stuff. It undermines the relationship between the sexes. There's a lot going on to undermine. It's all satanic because they were actually meant to be together. That's how it's supposed to be. You're not, as a rule, meant to have just a man or just a woman. They're supposed to pair up. They're supposed to ultimately be married. Now, that is actually the point, a big part of the point of most people's lives. You say, well, what about the exceptions? There are exceptions, but can I just make it clear? Exceptions by their very nature are exceptions, as in they're not very common. And the reason that there is a rise in singleness in culture and there is a rise in singleness in the church is not because there are more exceptions. The exceptions have been the same all along. It's cultural forces at play, okay? Cultural forces that are not healthy. And I just alluded to some of them very quickly. But let me mention 3 exceptions to which Jesus refers. And he refers to these in Matthew 19. For the sake of time, I won't get you to turn to it, but you can just write it down so you can read it. But he talks about 3 categories of people for whom it may not be given that they get married. 1, he calls eunuchs from birth. 2, he calls those made eunuchs by men. And the 3rd one, he calls those who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. The first one, eunuchs from birth, seems to be a reference to those who have some kind of disability or something about them that makes marriage unsuitable or unlikely from birth. Such people exist. Or there are those that have been made eunuchs by men. And in ancient times, that was a category. A eunuch was a castrated man. And this is what they did to men who were to spend their lives serving as servants and slaves. It was a thing right through the ancient world. And so there are those who have been made eunuchs by the actions of men. And you say, well, that's no longer relevant. Actually, it is relevant in our day again because of the transgender movement. And all of a sudden you do have men who have been particularly, but women as well, who have been a certain distance down the transgender pathway and things have been done to them that cannot be undone. It's a very sad situation. And so this category of person exists once again. There's actually, I might even write it down and read it out in the next session, but there's a very beautiful verse for these people in Isaiah, which talks about the fact that God welcomes them. And anyway, but those people exist. Finally, there are those that have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. So, the idea here probably being that there are people who are engaged in such a calling for the kingdom of God that they are unsuited to marriage. The calling makes them unsuited to marriage. I think the Apostle Paul puts his hand up and says, that's me. Although there is a debate about whether the Apostle Paul was married at some point in his life because he was a Pharisee. And the understanding is you couldn't be a Pharisee if you weren't married. So he isn't married when he says that, but who knows. But he puts his hand up. So there is such a thing. I think possibly the Catholic Church would put priests in this category. I would think. Yes, thumbs up at the back. There you go. So there are people who are set aside for the work of God. I just want to make this point though. Marriage is like nearly all the time a net benefit to the person. A good marriage. I mean, you get the other ones. It's nearly all the time a net benefit to the person. It's a risky business, by the way. Let's not, be foolish about that. It's a risky business. You've got to make sure that it's God's will. But that is nearly always a net benefit to a person, even if they've got a hard job to do. So this is really not a common category. Again, I make the reference to the exceptions. This is truly an exception. And then I just want to add two exceptions that Jesus didn't mention, but that must be there. The first one is that we live in a fallen world, and nothing will be perfect, and nothing will go to plan every time. By virtue of a fallen world, you will get breakages in the system all over the place. And there may be people who never end up married because we live in a fallen world. There are also, obviously, we humans, we err by nature. And there is by reason of foolishness, mistakes, mucking it up. There are people's life stories that didn't go to plan because of their own errors, and therefore they wind up unmarried. But I want to say this. It is true. I mean, Jesus is on to something here with being made single for the kingdom of God. It is true that it does enable you in certain ways to commit yourself to work for the kingdom of God in ways that you simply couldn't otherwise do. There is no doubt. And so I want to say, whether or not anyone is in an exception, I'm not even sure that people necessarily know, like made single for the kingdom of God. That might be something that comes together through the story of your life. It might not be something you know straight away. But I just want to say this. For those who are single in the room, which is the overwhelming majority of you, I just want to say, consider this. Make it a singleness for the kingdom of God. Right? You have time. You have space. You can completely commit yourself to that which is worthwhile, that which serves God. Now, obviously, a family is worthwhile and serves God, but that's clearly out of the picture at the moment. Meanwhile, don't just sit around. And by the way, by doing more for the kingdom of God, and by committing yourself to it, to be involved in ways that you even otherwise couldn't, you will probably become a more suitable person for someone to marry at the same time. So it's win-win. And I want to quote the Apostle Paul. He says, redeem the time. Don't waste your moments. Redeem the time, for the days are evil. And single people have been given a gift of time. They've been given a gift of energies that can be wholly spent somewhere on something. So don't sit around. Find those things. And they might start out as a lot of little things, and they will grow. One of the things you read in the New Testament is a great principle. Jesus said, he who is faithful over little will be set over much. And believe me, it starts very small. You just do a couple of things that are in front of you to do. In your circumstances. A lot of people think they get quite discontented with their circumstances and they decide that they're going to fly halfway over the world to go to a new place and minister somewhere else, or what they flee their circumstances. I want to caution against fleeing your circumstances. God has put you in a set of circumstances. And there will be things in your circumstances to be faithful to. And when it's time to move, God will move you. Don't move yourself. Real big problem with people running away from things at the moment that I have noticed out there. But that's what I would say. Unmarried people, pretty much all of us, make it a singleness for the kingdom of God, and it will work out for good in his plan.